Hey, good Thursday evening, folks. Brian Bledsoe with you here once again, host of the Desert Farmer Podcast. So good to be with you again. Thank you for being loyal viewers and listeners. The past few of these podcasts have been absolutely bangers as far as the amount of feedback that I'm getting from a lot of you and the overall interest in the topics that we're talking about. So a big thank you for that. We've obviously got a lot of information to get through today. I'm going to cover a lot of different topics in this episode. So it's one of those times where if you are interested in this type of stuff, you better buckle up because I'm going to take you through a journey here that is going to talk a lot about not only what's going on currently, the Madden-Julian oscillation, what the models are looking like as far as over the next month and a half. And I'm also going to spend a good deal of time revisiting some of the analog type information that I've been putting out here on the Desert Farmer Podcast and chatting a lot with you folks on Twitter and Facebook over the past several days about. So I'm fired up. I hope you're fired up. Before I get down to that, I want to give you folks my contact information. If there's anything that I can do for you, especially in the ag sector, which is my heritage, it's my people, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. A lot of clients throughout the Great Plains. I can give you those references and get down to that. So I hope you tolerate that short little advertisement. But right now, let's talk about what the past 60 days have looked like. I know a lot of you folks participate in the annual forage or PRF program, so I like to revisit that once we put a bow on each month. And this is the precipitation anomaly as a percent of normal. You know what normal is in the plains, folks? It's way too little plus way too much divided by 2. That's a number you never get anyway. That's what normal and average is right here in the Great Plains. So when you see these big anomalies one way or another, that's how we roll. You know, that we live in an extreme place out here across the Western High Plains, and you can clearly see the haves and the have-nots right here. Most of Montana's been doing pretty well. This little corridor here across southeast Montana and southwest North Dakota, northwest South Dakota right there, you know what? Hasn't been too lucky over the past 60 days. You know what they're going to get over the next, say, 48 hours? Plenty of snow. We're going to do a little bit of catching up with that in terms of precipitation. The same thing could be said here across north central and northeast Wyoming. We're going to do a little bit better there. We're going to bring a lot of snow here and across southern North Dakota, north central South Dakota. That's a good thing. But, you know, there's been a lot more have-nots than haves in this region. Now, if we go down to the south, it's just full of have-nots. I mean, we have been dealing with this dryness now, not just for the past 60 days, but really off and on for the past, several months, especially in this sector, really right here. We've got this area here, okay? Obviously, through the Intermountain West, we've had problems and still some problems here across western and central portions of Nebraska, even though last night we did real well from, say, Kearney, Grand Island, Hastings, up toward Norfolk, Sioux City, and obviously points eastward. Areas in east central and southeast Kansas have done well, Missouri, and those regions. But what we need to do, we need to get a storm in here that's slow enough to where we can yank moisture back here to the west to meet that storm to actually do some meaningful things. Now, it hasn't been a loss for everybody. Even up around Imperial, Nebraska, last night scored about a half an inch. There were a couple of spots there near Ray and Yuma, Colorado last night that got over a half an inch of liquid. So I'm not saying that everybody has missed out, but the lion's share of folks in those regions that I've mentioned have really missed out. That basically plays into what I'm talking about with this graphic and the short-term drought index. And you can see that a large part of the United States is dealing with drought. Some of the worst areas here over parts of Utah, okay, obviously here in Colorado, Wyoming, out here in the northeast Colorado, these areas here, okay, and these areas here across parts of the southern plains and back here to New Mexico have not done well either. Now, who's going to get some drought relief with this pattern? Well, obviously, if you are east of that line, your chances of getting significant drought relief are going to be a lot better than if you are west of that line. Save for these areas up here, okay, where you really don't have any, all right? The bighorns of Wyoming, a lot of east central Wyoming, southwest South Dakota, those areas, you need some water too. But areas here, farther east are going to benefit from this this initial pattern shift as we kicked off April, certainly, especially this area here in East Texas, Arkansas, and I think we're actually going to be able to do some damage in this here across portions of Oklahoma as well. It's just these areas back here to the west that are continuing to have problems. So with that in mind, we need to be aware of the green blobs, right? Remember in the previous Desert Farmer podcast, I put this graphic out there because the Climate Prediction Center is very generous with their green coloring across the majority of the country. So when we look at what the Climate Prediction Center forecast maps are and how they actually compare to the Euro products, what do I mean by the Euro products? The European model, the ensemble mean, the regular European ensemble mean, and the European artificial intelligence forecasting ensemble mean. Those two products to me perform better than anything else that's out there as far as looking at this type of forecast material. So when we look at the Climate Prediction Center forecast map, 6 to 10 day outlook, this was issued today. This takes into account April 8th through the 12th. Now, it obviously has the darkest shade of green in that corridor. You know what? I can buy that. I can buy that. All right. But it's got a lot of green. It's got a lot of green out here to the west. We've even got a little bit above average here throughout most of the Intermountain West, eastern Colorado. It says near normal down here across New Mexico. Now, most people that consume this, a lot of them are in agriculture, all right, looking at that 6 to 10 day, that 8 to 14, 8 to 16 day outlook, that type of thing. They do not look necessarily at the legend down here. So even when you see this legend in the light green that says leaning above, and then we come down here to the next shade, likely above. I think we got a little bit of work to do with that. All right. Why do I say that? Well, because from the 8th through the 12th, these are the precipitation totals that are being forecast by the regular European ensemble. All right. Are you telling me that these areas out here are leaning above? Okay. Remember, this area was near normal, but are we really leaning above here in western parts of the Nebraska Panhandle, southwest Nebraska? Are you telling me that 1/10 of an inch during that period of time is leaning above average for that time? I don't think so. There's your corridor right there. All right. If you're in that kind of tan, yellowish, orange, and red, look, I will buy that all day long. But the farther west you go, we got some issues. What about the artificial intelligence product, the Euro artificial intelligence? Look at that. Are you telling me that that's above average? Nope. How about leaning above? Nope. Sorry, not buying it back here. Just not buying it. What are you using to figure that stuff out? Why are we not incorporating the Euro products? Are we leaning on the GFS? Probably. Even the artificial intelligence GFS model is better than the traditional model that's out there, the deterministic. I don't know why we're still using that crap. All right. But even the European artificial intelligence still favors that corridor. What about the 8 to 14 day outlook? All right. This is from April 10th through the 16th. April 10th through the 16th. Got it. On board. Look at this. Leaning above all the way back here. Leaning above. All right, well, let's see what the Euro products have to say. These are the forecast precipitation anomalies for just the 5-day period. This takes us through the 15th. All right, wasn't going to be a whole lot of difference. All right, 5-day period there. Look at these anomalies back here. Cheyenne, 1/10 of an inch below average. Fort Morgan, 4/10 of an inch below average. Are we a little above here? Maybe. Is this going to be a significant dent in what we need? No, it's not. This corridor is going to continue to do best until we yank the moisture back west and are able to do something with it. This is just with the regular European ensemble, all right? When I switch to the artificial intelligence, there's not a whole lot of difference. That's Lamar, 1/10 of an inch below average. We've got, about 1/1300 of an inch below average. Places like, Imperial, back here toward Yuma and Ray, Cheyenne, 600s below average right there. All right. We are able to draw some better moisture farther west. All right. But not up here in this corridor. Maybe down here across East Central and Southeast New Mexico and West Texas, which is a good thing. You know, I'm all on board. If we're going to do above average precipitation from Amarillo to Midland and Odessa, all the way down toward Alpine, perfect. I'm on board with that because as I've said many times, all right, many times, a lot of times it's got to rain out here before it can rain back this far to the west and northwest. It's just how it rolls sometimes. All right. Now let's look at it. The Euro and the Euro Artificial Intelligence Ensemble means their complete 15-day precipitation anomaly forecast. Does that look like we are leaning above? Look at that. No, 15 days, that 2-week period, we are below average here. Where are we above average? In the same sectors that I've been talking about. All right. And obviously we're sprinkling in some of this up here with the storm that's coming through over the next 48 hours. All right. And what about the artificial intelligence? Same story. It's got the same precipitation deficits here. And in some cases here, okay, along the front range of Colorado, northeast Colorado, southwest and central Nebraska, we're running anywhere from a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch below average being forecast by the artificial intelligence model here from the Euro for that 2-week period. Why are we throwing green everywhere? Climate Prediction Center. And if you are consuming that product as an agricultural producer, it is buyer beware for the reasons that I've mentioned, for the reasons that I've showed you right there. It's just not a good product. It's not interpreted well at all. It's better to dive into the modeling, reliable modeling, as reliable as it can be this time of year, because again, things change frequently. But I'm not looking at the individual numbers here. I'm looking at the trend. Let's put a bow on that. Let's go to the Madden-Julian oscillation. What is it? When you hear something referenced as the MJO, all right, that is the Madden-Julian oscillation. I talked and I put a thread on Twitter about this earlier in the week, and it took off, did really well, because there's just not a lot of folks out there in the lay terms that know what's going on. All right, so this graphic was put out by Mike Baker from the National Weather Service out of Boulder years ago. It's a fantastic graphic. Mike really knows his stuff, did a really excellent job putting this together. And what the MJO is simply is a big cluster of thunderstorms, rain, wind, what have you, that take off usually over in the Indian Ocean. And a lot of times it takes about 30 to 60 days to move along the equator and circle the globe. Now, it's not always a 30, 60 day, time frame that it circles. Sometimes it gets stuck. Sometimes it gets locked into one spot. Sometimes the signal is weak. There are a lot of different variables here, all right, that play into how this thing operates. But this is essentially a very important driver in that 30 to 60 day forecast, that sub-seasonal level, to determine what's going to happen. Really important. If you are working in that 30 to 60 day forecast product and you don't follow what the MJO is doing, or you're not familiar with it, you really need to look at it and bone up on it, because it is a huge player in what we're seeing, especially different times of year, and also with different types of ENSO phase and ENSO transition phase. All right. So let's dig into it a little bit. Let's look at the current MJO model forecast. This is the European extended model. All right. The last run came in last night. Another run of this will come in tonight, but it goes out through May 2nd. Here's where it started. All right. Here's where it started down here, 20th and 21st of March, circling around up here. Boom, 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 coming in here. Basically, what I'm getting at, do you see all of these kind of light greenish, yellowish, greenish type of lines here? where are they mostly favoring? Are they favoring areas over here in phase 2, 3, 4, 5? Not so much. Or are they favoring over here in phase 7, 8, and 1? A lot of these lines over here in the overall forecast, all the way through May 2nd, is favoring out here. Now, something to know about this graphic. The farther away from center those lines get, the stronger the MJO signal, the stronger it's going to be. All right. So this is the forecast for the European extended. Let's look at the Bureau of Meteorology extended guidance here. Very much the same story. All right. Very much the same story. Look where all those yellow lines are. Phase 7, 8, 1. Not much business going on over here. Why is that important? Well, historically, for a couple of reasons. Phase 7, 8, and 1 traditionally will light things up across the middle part of the country, especially through the western high plains. All right. And when the MJO especially favors phase 8 and 1, that means that the longer we stay in that, the better prospects we have of seeing a stronger Eastern Pacific based El Nino event. I'm going to get more to that here in just a little bit. But when we see the MJO favor those 7, 8, 1 phases, it is kind of a tell, if you will. The more it favors those phases, the better shot that we're going to see a stronger east-based El Nino event, because we've got warm water being shoved eastward across the equator right now. More on that in a second. But the composites for March, April, May, all right, composites. Phase 1, look at the green. That's where we traditionally see above average precipitation in phase 1. Phase 7, same thing, out here in the plains and farther east. Phase 8, look at that corridor right there, right through there, right up the western high plains, all right? So especially the more we sit in phase 8 and 1, okay, phase 8 and 1 benefits those western high plains in a major league fashion. Other phases can do it too, but when we're in phase 6, look what it does. It benefits areas farther east. You get that southwest to northeast line right there, all right? I'm a huge fan of phase 8 and 1 in the western high plains, if you couldn't tell. What does the European extended model show us? From April 17th through May 17th. Let's look at the upper level weather pattern first, all right? What I'm looking for right here is bagginess back here across the west and the southwest part of the country. I'm looking for southwesterly flow here. That's the prevailing upper level weather pattern from April 17th through May 17th. When we get that southwesterly flow going, that means we've got energy coming into the west and the southwest part of the country. We can open up the Gulf, bring moisture back here farther west, especially if we can get those systems to slow down and dig a little bit, which if we get into springtime deep enough, that's the season where we can see some cutoff lows across the southwest part of the country, yank that moisture back to truly benefit us. Now, the forecast temperature and precipitation anomaly for that time frame, all right, you can see generally we're still above average temperature-wise in this quarter. Why do I think that is? Well, because we don't have any real soil moisture here. So that dry ground heats up better. It's harder to overturn and cancel out that drought signal when that's going on, all right? And we have average to cooler than average over the top. Not out of the question to see that, this time of year. But the farther west and southwest you go, we're still looking at above average. Now, because we've got generally southwesterly flow coming in here, that's what we should see, because it's harder to get that, late season cold air to get that far south. Now, precipitation anomaly wise, all right, we are still active here. Montana, the Dakotas. Look at this though. We're starting to see more action western Nebraska, southeast Wyoming, northeast Colorado, even up here in northwest Kansas. Anytime I start to see some slight positive anomalies here, all right, that's Ulysses, Kansas, I'm on board. What do you say, Amarillo? Almost 0.2 of an inch below average? Don't know about that. what about this? Okay. What about that? Are we really going to see things shut off after we get through this pattern during that period of time? We might get a little bit of a break in there. However, what I'm looking for every day with the European extended, and it was even more prominent yesterday, are we yanking moisture far enough west to really light things up here in the Western Plains? Or is it always going to be shoved eastward? Or are we more active over the top too? So the fact that we don't have some gigantic ball of deep brown and red here in the middle part of the country for that 30-day period, I'll take that as a win right now and work on the details as we get closer. Something's got to change for us to do that. The MJO favoring those phases that I just showed you is a decent recipe for us to start to light things up in the Western High Plains. A lot of things are working in tandem with these pattern changes that are taking place in the Pacific. Speaking of which, let's talk about ENSO. Quick ENSO update here. These are your current sea surface temperature anomalies. All right. Look at all the warmer than average water here. All right. You know what that stuff is doing right now? It is getting shoved eastward by some very strong westerly wind bursts coming out of Indonesia. All right. We are warmer than average here. We have a very positive Pacific meridional mode from the Baja out here to the south of Hawaii. You might say a lot of times, oh, what's this cooler than average water in the Gulf of Alaska? Do we need to be concerned about that dropping southward and, creating that cold horseshoe that gives us the drought? I have had so many questions about 2012. So many questions about 2012. This is not 2012. That doesn't mean that some parts of the country can't see drought. But if we see drought and dryness, like some areas saw in 2012, it's not going to be because of that sea surface temperature anomaly configuration right there. I'll tell you that. Why has it been colder than average up here in the Gulf of Alaska? Well, because we've had storms going through here. Those storms churn up the water. They upwell cooler water from beneath. Do I expect that to continue? No, I actually don't. So I would expect this to warm up a bit, actually, as we go forward. Okay? But that's what we've got right now going on. We are rapidly seeing the Pacific Ocean change. In fact, the latest Nino 3.4 index for the first time in a long time is north of zero. All right, north of zero. What does that mean? Well, traditionally, when we sit below negative 0.5, that's La Nina, or when we sit above positive 0.5, that is El Nino. So the trend here has been undeniable since early January that we've been stair-stepping ourselves up to complete neutrality right now and headed up here toward the positive phase of El Nino. Okay, not yet, but that's where we're headed. This is what's going on beneath the surface. All right, over here on the upper left-hand portion of the graphic, think of that as Indonesia. Over here on the right, think of that as the west coast of South America. We are going top down, all the way down to 450 meters deep. Look at this warm plume. This subsurface warm plume that continues to migrate and evolve eastward subsurface across the Pacific. All right. We are rapidly changing things beneath the surface, and eventually this is going to really change right at the surface. And you can see that taking place right now. And these warm plumes, they just kind of regenerate. Look at the one that made its way eastward. We've got another one right here that's very closely tied to a huge westerly wind burst that's coming across the Pacific Ocean from west to east. All right. This is something that kind of piggybacks on that. Over here on the right part of the graphic, you see those dotted lines right there? Those are upwelling Kelvin waves. All right. Think La Nina pattern when you see that. All right. Each one of those, La Nina. This goes all the way back, okay, to April of last year. So a year ago, we've got this. So starting in July last year, we started seeing these upwelling Kelvin waves that helped to precipitate the La Nina event that we have just put to bed. But look at this business. Starting in December, we started to see downwelling Kelvin waves take place. All right. And this last one that is getting going is likely going to be the strongest of them all. In fact, the westerly wind burst that's tied to this Kelvin wave might even rival some of the ones that we saw in 1997, or maybe even be record setting and go beyond what we saw in 1997 when we went from general neutrality early in the year to a really strong El Nino, later that year, a super El Nino event. So what you're seeing right here with these downwelling Kelvin waves, that means we are warming the surface. We are transitioning firmly away from that La Nina pattern towards something rapidly in the El Nino camp. All right. That's what we're doing right now. And this is a Hubmüller diagram, okay, all the way back to March 3rd. And what you're seeing right here, where you're seeing these reds, these are all stout westerly wind bursts. Now, the blues are easterly trade winds, all right? All we've done for the past month is weaken those easterly trades and really bring on these westerlies. And this westerly wind burst right here, okay, that's forecast to continue to take place and really max out from about the 5th of April through the 17th is really going to tip the scale here, all right? Because what that westerly wind burst does is it takes all that warm water down here and it shoves it eastward across the Pacific. Not only doing that at the subsurface level, but also on the surface. And when that happens, that's when we really start to see the move toward El Nino and where we can really start to see the ocean and the atmosphere couple. And that's really important because the longer these westerly wind bursts persist, the more of a chance we have of this being a strong east-based El Nino over here in the Eastern Pacific, okay? And the more of a chance that we have of seeing the subtropical jet stream really start to invigorate. And we're starting to see some of that take place already. The longer we see this persist, the more the signal really starts to kick into high gear. And a lot of times, that's why when we come out of a La Nina, all right, from late winter and spring, the western high plains are still really dry. There's still that La Nina hangover because the atmosphere really hasn't responded to what the ocean is doing just yet. But we're going to start to see that take place, all right? We're going to start to see the atmosphere and the ocean respond together. And you can see some of that take place right now. The southern oscillation, I talked about this last time that we talked, all right? Whenever you're up here at about a positive 12 or higher, or even a positive 10 or higher, that's when we technically think a La Nina-like atmospheric response, all right? But anything down here below 10, neutral, and anything below a negative 10, well, hey, that's when we're starting to talk about some serious business. And look at the SOI just tank over the past 9 days or so. I know there's been some tropical development over in the west and the southern Pacific that a lot of times can help to precipitate these changes. And don't think of the Southern Oscillation Index as the end-all, be-all in determining El Nino or La Nina. It is a noisy metric, all right? But when I start to see these types of changes and they're persistent changes, a lot of times that can mean that the ocean is, or the atmosphere is responding to these oceanic changes. So that is a positive sign right there. The latest relative Nino 3.4 index forecast out of the Bureau of Meteorology out of Australia, this was released on March 28th, is still very much on board. Now, as I have cautioned you repeatedly, don't necessarily look way out here to September, all right? Look at where we're going from now to June. From now to June. Rapid rise all the way up here to that El Nino camp by June. To me, that rapid change that's going to take place over about the next 3 months is oftentimes what really invigorates the pattern and spurs it to be more active, across the plains, especially the western high plains. It takes some time, all right? This is not an overnight process. It's been in the making since December, and we've had to get out of that La Nina pattern. And we're starting to see that take place. Not everywhere all at once, but I'm optimistic about some of the changes that I've shared with you today. So before we look at the analogs, all right, I really want to be clear about this because I've had numerous questions on Twitter, Facebook about this. What is that perfect analog run? Hey, look, searching for that one perfect analog is a fool's errand. That's just not going to happen. you are setting yourself up for failure. You've got unrealistic expectations. But what we can do is if we put a good amount of similar years in that analog package, we can get an idea of generally what to expect or how things can oftentimes transition for a particular region over a period of time. I think that's what you have to think about when you look at these analog years. All right. They're not perfect. They're not designed to be perfect. We've changed since the past several years. Every year is different, and every ENSO event is different with different nuances. There isn't just one flavor of ENSO. Is this El Nino going to develop in the East Pacific? Is it going to stay in the West Pacific? Is it going to be in the Central Pacific? Well, right now, I think out of all three of those things, a West Pacific-based El Nino, I think is the least likely that we're going to see. I would say that an East-based or a basin-wide type traditional El Nino is probably more likely what we're going to see, more akin to what we saw in 1957, 1965, 1972, 1982, 1997, 2015, and a little bit of flavor in that with 2023, all right? A little bit, all right? But it isn't just one flavor. There's a bunch of things we have to consider. And bottom line, are we magnificent and great at seasonal forecasting? No, we're not. It is a work in progress always. So if you are somebody that frequents what these analog packages are and what the models are doing, good for you. Good for you, because they're always updating, they're always evolving. But if you are someone that looks at this now and doesn't check it out again until August and say, well, what the hell happened? That's not a very good way to go about doing business. It's just not. You are setting yourself up for failure, period. End of story. And I was out on the travel circuit a lot from December right through, March. And that was the real message that I was trying to drive home to folks. Stay current with the products. Stay current with someone you trust who can walk you through this stuff in a realistic, measured, practical, actionable type of way. That's all I have to say about that. Let's look at the analogs. First of all, let's look at the relative oceanic Nino index. All right. NOAA changed how they kind of see El Ninos and La Ninas here recently. All right. So let's look at this all the way back to 50. All right. Going back to 1951. Again, 1951 was a transition year, right? La Nina first. We went to El Nino. Was it a strong El Nino? No. I had 51 in my analog package back in the fall. All right. Chopped it off. What about 57? 57, we were right there at neutral. All right. So we weren't quite down there into negative territory, but we rapidly went to El Nino. All right. And a strong El Nino by the end of the year. We were up there at around 2 degrees Celsius above average. And we actually achieved that when we went into 1958. Remember, when this El Nino gets established this year, it's not just going to be for a few months. It's going to linger into 2027, in my opinion. I think that, history suggests that. The modeling suggests that it's not going to just achieve super El Nino status and then fall off a cliff. Not going to do that. All right. So 57 is still in my camp, maybe a little less favorable. 57 is in my camp. Interesting part about 57 in late March of 1957. I think it was right around the 25th of March, actually. Huge blizzard across the Western High Plains, Eastern Colorado and Western Kansas. A lot of that was owing to the transition that was underway during that period of time, in my opinion, from the La Nina pattern that was so brutal, all right, through those mid-50s to that El Nino that actually helped things relax. Let's go beyond that. 60s, 1963, is that something we want to throw in there? I just don't think the transition was fast enough. Went to a moderate El Nino later, not putting it in my camp. Not now. 1965, still in my camp. Coming out of a weak La Nina, you can see it right there. We were at El Nino status by April, May, June. Strong El Nino by fall and winter. And then we tailored it off by next spring. 65 is in my camp. Has been from the beginning with this. I think it's a good one. 1972. Okay. There's your weak La Nina signal. Look where we went. Strong El Nino by the end of the year. We were already technically in El Nino by that March, April, May timeframe. All right, right there. 72 is in my camp. 76, not in my camp. I think it held on to that La Nina signal too long, and we didn't go strong enough on the back end. Transition, in my opinion, wasn't rapid enough. Okay, just my opinion. It's what I think. 1982, we were right there around neutral. December, January, February, went quickly into El Nino, March, April, May, one of the stronger El Ninos on record by year's end. And we still carried that over actually through the middle of 1983. All right. For those of you in the Western High Plains, huge Christmas blizzard, okay, in eastern Colorado and across the western parts of the Western High Plains in Christmas of 1982. I remember that very well at our ranch. On Christmas Eve, we had a dairy. My dad was standing at the dairy. Mom, my brother, and I, we had to do Christmas Eve alone. Dad came home the next day. Couldn't see. That's how awful the weather was. He couldn't see, 3 feet outside the door. That's how bad the blizzard was. You folks that remember that one, yeah, Christmas in 1982 was brutal. One of the bigger blizzards in Denver metro history, actually. Okay. Let's go beyond that. Oh, let's back up here one. 1986, I've seen kicked around. Still had the La Nina signal hanging over there. Didn't make the transition fast enough. I would say a moderate El Nino by the end. It's not a terrible one. I just don't think we transitioned fast enough, like what we're doing right now. What about the 90s? All right. What about 91? Not bad, but we didn't come out of a La Nina then. The 90s were different too. Ocean was different, warmer. Could we have 91 in there? Strong El Nino by the end of the year. We carried that over to 92. Not a bad one. I will maybe start to entertain 91 a little bit more. I'm just not as convinced right there. 97 is actually one of my favorites. Why? Because the westerly wind bursts that are taking place right now very closely mimic what we saw in 1997. Plus, we technically came out of a weak La Nina signal here, all right? And then we went to weak El Nino status, March, April, May, to very powerful El Nino there at the end of the year. So 97 is definitely in that package. What about 2002? All right. I don't think it went fast enough. Same story. And I don't think our El Nino is strong enough. All right. We hovered around neutral through that time frame. I think we're going to blow past that. All right. 2009, not bad. Negative 0.9 is what our relative Nino index was for December, January, February. But I just don't think we transitioned quickly enough. And I don't think our El Nino was strong enough there. So 09, not in my top. Not bad, just not in my top. What about 2015? 2015 was interesting because we were not in a weak La Nina, at least with the relative Nino index here, but we rapidly transitioned to El Nino, and one of the stronger El Ninos on record took place by later that year. All right, 2015 is in there. I'm actually going to look at 2015 separately here in just a second. What about the 2020s? Obviously, 2023, I've talked a lot about. Right there. Look at where we are currently. See our relative Nino index for December, January, February was negative 0.9. We were right there pretty closely. We transitioned pretty quickly, all right, but we didn't make real strong El Nino by the end of the year, at least in this metric, all right? 2023, I'm keeping simply because of the transition during the spring. But how we go into the later part of the year probably isn't going to work out like some of those other analogs. But I've still got it in there simply because it was recent too. All right. At least we have to look at it a little bit. That's one metric. The RONI is one metric. This is another metric. What is the difference here? The relative oceanic Nino index takes largely into account just sea surface temperature anomalies. All right. And if you're using just simply sea surface temperature anomalies, you can use that metric. But the multivariate ENSO index here takes into account a bigger body of work. Is the ENSO transition coupled with the atmosphere? And that's the metric that the multivariate ENSO index takes into account. How is the atmosphere responding? Which to me is more important because you can have either warm or cool sea surface temperature anomalies out there, but if the atmosphere isn't responding, Doesn't matter. Okay? We need the atmosphere to respond to what's going on. So the multivariate of ENSO index only goes back to 1979, sadly. All right. So we don't have the benefit of going back into the early 70s, the 60s, and the 50s. All right. We can infer what it might have been, but we don't have the actual metric. So when we look at 1982, there's our weak La Nina signal still going on. Look at that. By May and June, we were El Nino, strong El Nino later. So 82 is certainly in there. 86, again, not in there because I think we held on to the La Nina signal too long here. We didn't transition fast enough. Our El Nino wasn't strong enough right there. What about the 90s? 91, okay, again, is it there? Kind of messed around. Look at the multivariate index here, ENSO index, actually relaxed here. July and August, it didn't just go gangbusters. So no, 91 not in there for me. 97 is 100% in there for me. We still have the weak La Nina signal with the MEI. Flip it, El Nino signal by April, May, and look at that. With the way the modeling is structured with the forecast, all right, 97, I'll tell you, 97 may be our best analog right now. But it's not a perfect one. As I showed you before, don't look at it as a perfection. Look at it as the trend that took place in 97, at least with the MEI. Not bad, okay? What about the 2000s here? 02, as I said, we transitioned, but I'm not in on 02. 09, again, I don't think the signal was strong enough. Look at the MEI. We were still carrying a La Nina signal here in the April, May at the end of the day here. We didn't make a full push to weak El Nino status until June, July. Don't think so. 210 through 26, early 26, here we go. What about 15? 15 makes some sense. Here we messed around with neutrality. Firm push, April, May, into that El Nino. A lot of that took place because, again, we had some really strong westerly wind bursts, some downwelling Kelvin waves that shoved us out of neutrality into a strong atmospheric El Nino signal during the back, really 60% of 2015 and into early 2016. Okay? 2015's in there. 2018, nope, not for me. 23, we had that La Nina signal go through Feb, March, and then look what we did. We had a weak signal there, but we made a transition across, a big transition really from Jan and Feb to May and June. And then we continued with that El Nino signal, a solid one here, not a real strong one, but a solid one through the remainder of the year. And again, the transition to me is one of the more important things. So back here into 26, okay, for December, January, our MEI was negative 0.8. Jan and Feb, it was negative 0.9. What do you think Feb, March is going to be? Well, I think we're going to be yanked right out of that cold period, and we're going to see a transition very similar to what we saw up here in 2015. Also, what we saw here from Feb, March to May, June, that type of transition, but it's probably going to be more robust, is my point. No perfect analog. We are looking purely for the trends. So let's look at some of how these analogs played out here. Potential precipitation anomaly analogs for April. I know we're already a couple of days in. We're still going to look at April, just the precipitation. And again, I've got them here. 57, 65, 72, 82, 97, 23. Next, when I'm gonna look at some of the modeling that comes in here. Again, we've got the European seasonal model here in 3 days, the NMME a couple of days thereafter, and I'm probably going to lop a couple of these off, or I may keep a couple. We'll have to wait and see. But for April, look what happens in all of these Aprils. Texas got wet. All right, this sector was wet. Wasn't wet for everybody here. All right, but notice this quadrant here. Okay, didn't turn off wet in those Aprils. All right, I think we're missing here. I think we're going to do a lot better here for April, especially here across Missouri, which is going to be so wet. So like I said, it's not perfect. Not every hits. but we are still seeing that relatively dry signal back here across the western high plains. When we get wetter, the farther south you go. What about May? Again, throughout history, May still appears to be a significant switch. And you can see that here in the analogs. Look at this, right? All the way through here. All the way from northeast Montana, all the way down here through parts of Arizona, New Mexico. We are just bringing moisture from the Gulf up through the western high plains and parts of the central high plains. These were really wet times here. Every single one of those Mays. So to go from the signal we had before to that is impressive. Now, you might say, well, what's going on here in the Corn Belt? A lot of times with some of these transition years, we can have high pressure set up over Canada, Southeast Canada, or here over the Great Lakes, and it brings drier air down like this. It dominates with drier air farther east, and the main focus for the moisture does this, all right? Shows up in a lot of these Mays. I mean, this year is going to be that way. I'm just saying it shows up in a lot of the Mays. What about for June? June, we see some transitions take place. Again, parts of these areas up here over the Midwest and the Corn Belt, still under the influence of that relatively drier flow. All right, we still going bangered moisture out here in the western high plains and across parts of the west. But while we're doing that, okay, especially through this corridor, we are starting to dry things out. All right, we are starting to dry things out. We saw this in 23, as late as 23 here. We did that. Front loaded all that moisture in Texas in the spring and shut the door in June. History shows that that's on the table here, but we are still wetter across northwest Texas, eastern Colorado, a large part of Kansas, southwest and western Nebraska, Wyoming, southern Montana, those areas there. In those Junes, they end up being wetter. What about July? July, we get more mixed. Look at the dry signal here that extends for some of these areas, okay, that we're wetter, especially central and southeast Texas. This is a lot of times where Texas turns, when we get a more east-based and traditional type of El Nino flavor. Texas and parts of southern New Mexico, southern Arizona, the monsoon sometimes can come a little bit late. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to be the case this year, because some models are forecasting a very robust monsoon across parts of the Southwest. So we've got a little bit of work to do with that. But for Texas in particular, it shuts off. So I've said this repeatedly to a lot of my clients, and I've got a lot of them in Texas, southern, southeast Oklahoma, western Arkansas, southeast Kansas. Those communities a lot of times will start to dry out after that wet spring, and sometimes it can be especially dry. What about August? Same signal. In fact, we've even dried things out, continue to dry things out, all right, for these areas here. Monsoon goes gangbusters, all right, but areas just to the east, West Texas, virtually all of Texas, virtually all of Oklahoma, south central and southeast Kansas. Look at the Gulf Coast in the southeast. That dry signal is there for a reason, because we string these years together. It's very persistent. All right. So July and August, flash drought after a wet spring on the table for those southern plains. You better believe it, in my opinion. Look at the wetness, though, here across Missouri, parts of the Corn Belt. Still a little bit drier here, southeast South Dakota, northwest Iowa in these times. September, a little bit mixed. We start to see some dryness break down here in Texas. Some seasonal change. We'll likely have some hurricane activity that will likely be above average in the eastern Pacific off the Baja. Some of that moisture can get entrained and come up like this. We're still dealing with monsoonal stuff. We're bringing energy down from the north to meet some of that moisture. So again, still some residual dryness here, south central Oklahoma, north central Texas, even south Texas into September, but it's not as stout, certainly, as it was from late June, July, and into August for those times. All right. Let's look at 2015. I'm going to finish with 2015. Taking up enough of your time today. Precipitation anomalies, April to May. 2015, most of the April was down here in Texas and Oklahoma, but by May, it was up here to the northwest too. All right. May was very wet across parts of the western high plains. But notice in May, April, May of 15, we didn't see tremendous dryness here. A little bit of patchy dryness, but not tremendous dryness here across the Corn Belt and the Midwest, which leads me to believe that while the high pressure might have been present, it wasn't as strong as it was maybe in 2023, okay? That really perpetuated that stout dry signal. What about May, June? May, June, it was just wet everywhere, all right, except parts of the Southeast. Do I think that that's on the table for this year? It's tough to say. You know, we got a bigger head start in 2015 with this ENSO transition. We didn't have La Nina to overcome. We immediately started shoving water in the ground. So do I think it's going to be like this for May and June everywhere? Probably not. I'd be a little bit surprised by that. There will be some dry pockets, perhaps up here over parts of the Corn Belt and maybe up here over parts of Montana too. All right. But you can still see the Western High Plains wetter than average right there. June and July 2015, we were wet, very wet through the Corn Belt here. We were still doing okay through the Western High Plains here in June and July. We were starting to see some signs of drying out from East Texas down along the Gulf Coast. We were drier up in the Pacific Northwest too. All right. July, August. Look at the July, August dry signal. Traditionally, in the same places I just showed you in those other analogs. Central and east and southern Texas, the Gulf Coast. We were still doing okay out west because we had monsoonal moisture. But notice, these areas up here, which were so wet, started to dry out. Southwest Nebraska, northeast Colorado, northwest Kansas. A lot of that moisture was front-loaded in the springtime. All right, but again, that's just July, August of 2015. If we look at August, September of 2015, we were drier across the board. But again, look where the stoutest dry signal was located, all right? Central and East Texas, Gulf Coast, some parts of the Central Plains, and obviously out on the East Coast. Folks, that's what I have for you today. I know that was a ton of information, a lot of stuff, maybe overwhelming to some. Maybe you didn't watch it all. Maybe you're cycling through. I don't care. I want to have the conversation about what I think is important to folks that use this information in agriculture. I enjoy breaking it down for you. I've been breaking this stuff down for my clients now for months and weeks, looking at this stuff every single day. And it is a very important time. So as I've said, thank you very much for listening or watching here on the Desert Farmer Podcast. I greatly appreciate it. And if there's anything that I can do for you, you know exactly how to get in touch with me right there. It's my cell phone. That is my email. If you want a free quote for your business, go to brianbledsoeweather.com, smash that blue bar right there in the center part, and I'll get to work for you. Until we talk again here on the Desert Farmer Podcast, you folks be well. Guns up, Tech.